average day thinking about it? Most of us believe we need it, and many of us find it in work, so it's going to be a problem if we stop working. Or is it? Meaning and work. Simon Sinek has made a name for himself with books that propound a simple but important truth. If you have a clear purpose which inspires others, you can achieve great things. His best-known saying is, working hard for something we don't care about is called stress. Working hard for something we love is called passion. We could be forgiven for thinking that a law was passed a few years ago in the U.S. requiring business leaders, and people who want to be business leaders, to talk about their passion for their business. But most people don't feel passionate about their work, even if they pretend to. In fact, many people are positively alienated by their jobs. They find them meaningless and boring. Yet even these people usually define themselves by what they do for a living. If you ask someone at a party what they do, they are likely to reply that they are an accountant, a taxi driver, or an electrician. They are less likely to say that they are the coach of their child's football club, or a cinema goer, or a reader. No doubt this is partly due to the amount of time that our jobs absorb. But then again, we don't define ourselves as sleepers. It also has to do with work being the activity that provides our income, which is why home-based parents often feel sheepish about naming that as their work. They shouldn't. It is some of the hardest but most rewarding work I've ever done. So work helps define us, and it gives many of us purpose. It even gives some of us meaning. So how damaging would it be if we lost it? Unemployed people often struggle with depression, but they are experiencing it in the context of a society where it seems that everyone else has a job. They are also on a lower income than the employed people around them. How bad would it be if everyone else was also unemployed and receiving a decent income? Fortunately, there are a couple of places we can look for an answer to that question. The rich and the old. The agricultural revolution, around 12,000 years ago, created sustainable surpluses of food and other basic resources. This enabled a class of people to stop doing the work that pretty much all humans had done since our arrival on the planet, which was foraging and hunting for food. They became tribal leaders, kings, warriors, priests, traders, and so on. Sometimes they spent as much time on these activities as the people who continued to forage and hunt, but sometimes they took time off, deliberately or by happenstance, and engaged in lives of leisure. In Europe, these people became known as aristocrats, from a Greek word meaning the best, originally in a military sense and then a political one. Some aristocrats did jobs. They ran agricultural concerns, they got involved in politics, and in some countries they ran empires. Occasionally they became men, and more rarely women, of science. Famously, they disdained trade and commerce, regarding those activities as the preserve of the class below them, the middle class. Many aristocrats did not work, including almost all the female ones. They led lives of leisure. As young men, and in a few cases young women, they toured classical Greek and Roman sites in the Mediterranean countries. Returning home, they mostly socialized. Their lives revolved around balls, hunts, and visits to their local peers, interspersed with the glamour and tragedy of war, if that was their inclination. This lifestyle was chronicled in the novel An Art Form, which first acquired its current realistic form in the early 18th century. The lives depicted by Jane Austen and her contemporaries may seem tame to modern readers who have experienced international travel and expect simultaneous global communications, but they were agreeable lives compared to what their poorer contemporaries had to put up with. Addictions to gambling and drink were a hazard, and of course a minority of this pampered class destroyed themselves and their families with these vices. But this was unusual, and by and large most 18th and 19th century European aristocrats seemed to have passed their lives without great concern about their lack of meaning. Whether these lives were worthwhile or not, whether or not they had meaning, is probably not for us to judge, but there is no evidence of widespread existential angst among the nobility. In fact, it is these privileged people who made most of the advances in human thought and art in previous centuries, precisely because they did not need to work for a living or eke out an existence as subsistence farmers. If they did not produce the memorable work themselves, they often sponsored it by employing talented artisans. so it seems there is much to be said for the ability to be idle. The other group we can look to for evidence about the effects of joblessness are retired people. The conventional wisdom used to be that growing old was an almost unmitigated disaster. Old age ain't no place for sissies, as Betty Davis said, although it's obviously better than the only alternative currently available. But starting in the 1990s, researchers began questioning this perception and found instead that the progress of happiness throughout life is U-shaped. We are at our happiest and most fulfilled when young. We become stressed and discontented in our prime and middle age, and we are happier and more relaxed again when older, despite the onset of physical disabilities and limitations. This pattern has been observed across a wide range of societies and over a substantial period of time. There are probably numerous causes of this effect, including the relinquishment of responsibility for children and the acquisition of wisdom to accept what life has thrown at us. But the absence of jobs plays a major role in the lives of the retired. Even if it is not causing the uptick in happiness, it is at least not preventing it. Virtually happy. Thus far in human history, we have had to find our meaning within the constraints of the three-dimensional world we live in, or in our imaginations. Technology is poised to open up a whole new space for us to explore together, the world of virtual reality. We don't yet know how we will react to this new universe, how we will behave in it, and what it will mean to us. We can be pretty confident that it will have a big impact. Diaspora, Greg Egan's novel of the far future, features an environment called the Truth Mines. It is a physical representation of mathematical theorems, albeit in virtual reality, which can seemingly be explored forever without exhausting all the discoveries that can be made. The ability to create virtual worlds that are so convincing to our brains that we almost lose the understanding that they are artificial may well allow us to expand enormously the space within which we find happiness and meaning. In summary, loss of meaning does not seem likely to be one of the biggest problems that widespread technological unemployment will create. 5.4. Allocation. The house on the beach. In a world where the majority of people cannot get jobs and are therefore paid a universal basic income, how will we allocate goods and services? At first sight, the answer seems simple and obvious. We will still have money, so we will still have the market. Supply and demand will still continue to operate like before. Let's assume we're at the point where a large majority of people get all their income from UBI. There would have to be an adjustment for people looking after children or other dependents, disability, and so on. But any extra income allocated for these needs would also be swallowed up by those needs. So in income terms, the society we are discussing would be an extremely egalitarian one. But this society of egalitarian incomes will have inherited a decidedly unegalitarian asset base. Houses are the most obvious and the most significant example. They were not all created equal. In a society where everyone's income is more or less the same, how will we decide who lives in the nice big houses in the posh part of town, and who lives in the small flat with no soundproofing in the grubby apartment block in the unfashionable suburb? Will it be like a game of musical chairs? We all work hard to improve our lot, and then when the machines take our jobs, the music stops and we all sit down in the chairs we have arrived at, and just stay there forever. That seems neither fair nor sustainable. With luck, we will be creating an economy of abundance in which machines carry out maintenance and improvement works with great efficiency and hence cheaply. In that case, we will set them to revitalizing and or replacing the stock of lower quality houses, and cars and boats and furniture and clothes, etc. But it will take a very long time indeed to build a nice new house for everyone who doesn't start off with one. And even when we have completed that gargantuan task, some houses will still be in much nicer places than others. This is the allocation problem. Some scarcity can never be abolished. There is a finite and regrettably small supply of large houses on empty white sand beaches fringed with palm trees leading down to a turquoise sea, or penthouse apartments on Manhattan's Fifth Avenue. There is a very small supply of Vermeers and Aston Martin DB5s. Do we decide that no one can own these things? Perhaps we could turn all the nice houses into museums and keep the scarce movable objects on display there, to be visited and perhaps used, on payment of a fee or by scheduled appointment. In that case, who will decide what the cutoff point is between a house which people can carry on living in and one which is too nice to be private property? VR to the rescue? At the time of writing, Palmer Luckey and John Carmack are hardly household names, but by the time this book is published, they may well be. In case they're not, they are the key executives of Oculus Rift, which looks set to be the first commercially available VR equipment to offer a convincingly immersive user experience. They talk about a moral imperative to make virtual reality available to us all. Luckey puts it like this: everyone wants to have a happy life, but it's going to be impossible to give everyone everything they want. Virtual reality can make it so anyone, anywhere, can have these experiences. Carmack continues, you could imagine almost everyone in the world owning good VR equipment. This means that some fraction of the desirable experiences of the wealthy can be synthesized and replicated for a much broader range of people. Other people have thought about these questions, and not everyone is delighted by the suggestions that VR can assuage the frustration caused by scarcity. Some people think it impossible, and others think it possible, but degrading. The Harvard political philosopher Robert Nozick described a thought experiment back in 1974 featuring an experience machine, which could recreate any sensation you choose. Your brain is persuaded that the experience is real, which means that you believe it too, but in fact, your body is lying in a flotation tank, deprived of all sensory input, while your brain is hooked up to the machine. Philosophers do a lot of their work by investigating their intuitions, and Nozick's intuition was that no one would use this machine because we value reality too highly. I find it surprising that he came to that conclusion back in 1974, and it would be an even more surprising conclusion to reach today, when so many people spend so much of their lives in simulated realities, albeit only imperfectly simulated. Certainly a great deal of money is being invested by smart people in the belief that we will consume VR avidly. Nozick died in 2002, so he won't have to find out for himself. Maybe he would be relieved. Other critics see the Oculus founder's view of the future as possible but frightening. Ethan Zuckerman is director of the MIT Center for Civic Media and thinks that the idea that we can make gross economic inequalities less relevant by giving poor people virtual bread and circuses is diabolical and delusional. Jaron Lanier is a computer scientist and writer who founded VR pioneer VPL Research, and is generally credited with popularizing the term virtual reality. He lambasts as evil the vision that the rich will become immortal, while everyone else will get simulated reality. I'd prefer to see a world where everyone is a first-class citizen, and we don't have people living in the Matrix. Only time will tell if VR is helpful, or even necessary, in enabling us to live in a world where machines have made humans unemployable. My own guess is that it will play a major role in the lives of most people, and that it will make them more productive, more fun, and more fulfilling. As Oculus's John Carmack puts it, if people are having a virtually happy life, they are having a happy life, period. Nevertheless, Zuckerman and Lanier have identified an important problem with the vision. It is not to do with VR so much as the potential separation of our species into two or more divergent camps. We will review this in more detail in the next section. Algocracy. Decisions about the allocation of resources are being made all the time in societies on scales both large and small. As argued above, capitalism has proved so effective in raising the living standard of societies which have adopted it. Paraphrasing Churchill again, it is the worst possible economic system except for all the others, because markets are highly efficient systems for allocating resources in economies characterized by scarcity. Historically, markets have consisted of people. There may be lots of people on both sides of the transaction. Flea markets are one example, eBay is another. Or there may be few buyers and many sellers, farmers selling to supermarket chains, or vice versa, supermarket chains selling to consumers. But typically, both buyers and sellers were human. That is changing. Algorithms, as we saw in Chapter 3, are sets of rules or instructions for a computer to follow. A model is built and refined by testing with data. Lots of data. In situations with well-defined processes and target outcomes, algorithms can be extremely efficient decision makers. We see this in our everyday lives. ATMs are operated by algorithms. No human responds to the instruction you type into the screen. They are efficient and effective, and most of us prefer to draw our cash from ATMs rather than queuing at a counter to have a human provide the service. Algorithms now take many decisions which were formerly the responsibility of humans. They initiate and execute many of the trades on stock and commodity exchanges. They manage resources within organizations providing utilities like electricity, gas, and water. They govern important parts of the supply chains which put food on supermarket shelves. With the rapidly increasing volume of data flowing from tiny sensors embedded in buildings, machinery, vehicles, and all kinds of products, and with the ever-improving performance of machine learning systems thanks to Moore's Law, algorithms are getting better and better at their jobs. They are getting better, cheaper, and faster than humans. As well as taking our jobs, they are taking our decisions. In his 2006 book, Virtual Migration, Indian-American academic A. Anish coined the name algocracy for this phenomenon. The difficulty with it has been explored in detail by the philosopher John Danaher, who sets the problem up as follows. Legitimate governance requires transparent decision-making processes which allow for involvement by the people affected. Algorithms are often not transparent, and their decision-making processes do not admit human participation. Therefore, algorithmic decision-making should be resisted. Danaher thinks that algocracy poses a threat to democratic legitimacy, but does not think that it can be or should be resisted. He thinks there will be important costs to embracing an algocracy, and we need to decide whether we are comfortable with those costs. Of course, many of the decisions being delegated to algorithms are ones we would not want returned to human hands, partly because the machines make the decisions so much better, and partly because the intellectual activity involved is deathly boring. It is not particularly ennobling to be responsible for the decision whether to switch a city's streetlights on at 6:20 or 6:30, but the decision could have a significant impact. The additional energy cost may or may not be offset by the improvements in road safety, and determining that equation could involve collating and analyzing millions of data points. Much better work for a machine than a man, surely. There are many decisions which machines could also make better than humans, but we might feel less comfortable having them do so. The allocation of new housing stock, the best date for an important election, the cost ceiling for a powerful new drug, for instance. Arguments are probably going to become increasingly common and increasingly vehement over which decisions should be made by machines and which by humans. 5.5. Cohesion. The scenario of the gods and the useless. As mentioned in Chapter 1 at the end of his July 2015 TED Talk, the author of Sapiens, Yuval Harari, makes a seemingly throwaway comment about humanity devolving into two classes, the gods and the useless. The audience laughs at this brutal assessment, but I suspect Harari is deadly serious. Imagine a society where the great majority of people lead lives of leisure, their income provided by a beneficent state or perhaps a gigantic charitable organization. They are not rich, they don't travel first class or frequent expensive restaurants, and they don't own multiple houses. But they have no pressing needs, and in fact they want for little. They enjoy socializing, learning, sports, exploration, and much of this is carried out in virtual worlds which are almost indistinguishable from reality. A small minority of people in this society do have jobs. Their work is pleasurable and intellectually stimulating, and not stressful. It involves monitoring and occasionally guiding or resetting the performance of the machines which run their society, machines which they own. Let's say that this elite minority is generous towards the majority which lives outside their gated communities and which does not visit the luxurious resorts they migrate between, and does not travel with them on their private helijets. They are effectively benign rulers, although both camps refrain from putting it like that. Now, in this future world, all members of the species of Homo sapiens are changing. They are using new technologies to enhance themselves both cognitively and physically. They use smart drugs, exoskeletons, and genetic technologies, among others. Maybe they have engineered themselves to need less sleep. Everyone has access to these technologies, but the elite has privileged access. They get them sooner, and this could be vitally important. I argued in Chapter 3.7 that concerns about a digital divide were exaggerated. Companies make much more money by selling lots of relatively cheap cars and smartphones to almost everyone than they ever could by selling just a handful of diamond-encrusted versions to the super rich. But we mustn't forget that technology is advancing at an accelerating rate. In the future society we are envisioning, important breakthroughs in physical and cognitive enhancement are announced every year, then every month, then every week. As artificial intelligence gets better and better, it fuels this improvement, even though it, the AI, is still narrow AI and far from becoming human-level artificial general intelligence, or AGI. It may become hard or even impossible to disseminate these cognitive and physical improvements quickly enough to avoid a profound separation between those with privileged access to them and the rest of us. So the elite will change faster than the rest. As the two groups lead largely separate lives, the widening gap may not be apparent to the majority, but the elite surely will know about it. They will decide that they must draw attention away from the fact, and they will take precautions to prevent attack, in case the majority should become aware of and resentful about what is happening. They will surround their gated communities with discrete machines which possess astonishingly powerful defensive and offensive capabilities. They will keep themselves more and more to themselves, meeting members of the majority less and less often. When they do meet, it will almost always be in virtual reality, where their avatars, their virtual representations in the VR environment, do not betray the widening gulf between the two types of humans. After a while, humans will evolve into two different species, the gods and the useless. Brave New World. This is not your average science fiction dystopia. The scenario most commonly offered up by Hollywood is that technology has pulled back the curtain which concealed the truly evil nature of the capitalism system, and mankind has fallen into a form of high-tech slavery, where the rich descendants of company CEOs and scheming tycoons and financiers brutalize an impoverished and oppressed majority. The movie Elysium is just one of many dreary examples of this tired old cliché. In it, as in so many others, society has actually regressed from capitalism into a sort of techno-feudalism. Any viewer who is half awake is wondering, since machines can do all the work, what is the point of enslaving humans? It is curious that the left-leaning culture prevalent in Hollywood impels it to issue these tirades against capitalism when Hollywood studios are themselves formidable exponents of the capitalist art. And it is curious that Hollywood stars who demand millions of dollars to make a single film complain that corporations are fueled by nothing but greed. A far more interesting scenario is Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which is a very subtle piece of world building. Almost everyone is content in the society which has been developed after an appalling military conflict. But it is clear to the reader that humanity has lost something important, and most of it has regressed to an almost infantile condition. Yet when a talented outsider arrives, he is unable to devise a way to improve the system, or to accommodate himself to it. He instinctively feels, and the reader is encouraged to agree, that his own life has shown him there is a better way to live, but he is unable to articulate or maintain it. In Huxley's story, humanity has achieved a stable equilibrium. Only a tiny minority of humans are aware of what has been sacrificed in order to achieve a society of such docility and acquiescence. Regular sex and a powerful drug called soma are the opiates of the masses. Huxley wrote the book in 1931, before the advent of rock and roll, so he couldn't anticipate Ian Dury's hedonistic mantra that sex and drugs and rock and roll were all his brain and body needed. Brave New World is certainly not intended as a blueprint. Even so, it is calm, and the specter of economic and social collapse seems to have been abolished, at least for the time being. It would be foolish of us to take even that much for granted. A society comprising gods and the useless might turn out to be inherently unstable. In a full-on conflict between them, it seems likely that the gods would have the means to protect themselves. But at what cost? Will capitalism remain fit for purpose? Private property is an essential feature of capitalism, and in particular, the private ownership of the means of production, exchange, and distribution. In market economies, most people earn their living by selling their labor, their time, and their physical and intellectual skills. People called entrepreneurs hire workers and combine their labor with the other major element of this capitalist economy, capital, which consists of money, machinery, land, buildings, and intellectual property. The entrepreneurs use the labor and the capital to develop and make products and services which they hope will be bought by enough people to turn a profit. The capital is put at risk during this process, and the profit is a reward and an incentive for the entrepreneurs and the owners of the capital, known as capitalists, who took that risk. The picture's complicated because we are all capitalists today. Much of the capital deployed by entrepreneurs is owned by financial institutions like insurers and pension companies, and ownership of these institutions is very widely distributed through pension plans. Many people are also shareholders in the companies they work for, thanks to employee share ownership schemes. In a capitalist economy where most people work, individuals who start off without any capital can acquire it by saving some of what they are paid for their labor, and by starting companies themselves. Countries where this is easy and celebrated tend to be better off than countries where the entrepreneurship is discouraged, or hampered by corruption, overregulation, or lack of infrastructure. Similarly, people who start off with capital can lose it by bad luck or poor judgment. It is not uncommon for families to go from rags to riches and back to rags within 3 generations. There are countries today where this kind of social mobility, both upward and downward, is very limited, and the elites are entrenched. Arguably, nowhere in the world has sufficient economic social mobility, but in many countries it does exist to some degree. As we have seen, after the economic singularity, there will be 2 major differences. First, if the prediction that most people will be unemployable comes true, then there will be pretty much no traffic, no economic and social mobility between the elite and the rest. This will be the case all over the world. If you can't do paid work, it is very hard to accumulate capital. Second, if the rate of technological progress continues to accelerate, the elite may avail themselves of the means of cognitive and physical enhancement to diverge from the majority, both physically and cognitively. The obvious but difficult remedy for this is to end the institution of private property. The means of production, exchange, and distribution would be placed into some kind of collective ownership to prevent the possibility of social and species fracture. As we saw in Chapter 3.1, this conclusion is rejected by the 2 most popular books published so far about technological unemployment. I share their inclination, and it makes me extremely uncomfortable. I was in business for 30 years before becoming a full-time writer and speaker, and I remain convinced of the largely positive effects of a regulated market economy with a welfare safety net. It seems to me that capitalism is the best economic system we know of for a society where humans do the work. But I fear that capitalism may not be so well suited for an economy of abundance, where machines do the work, where most people are unemployed, and where technology is changing the species quickly. I'm not pushing this argument hard. Not only does it make me uncomfortable, but one of the fundamental characteristics of a singularity is that it is even harder than usual to predict the future when there is an event horizon in the way. It is by no means certain that abandoning capitalism and private property is the only way to avoid fracture and collapse. It may be possible for all kinds of people to live in harmony in a society where a minority gets paid to work and owns most of the economy's assets, while everyone else lives happily on a universal basic income. It is not impossible to imagine a benign technocracy in which the majority of people really don't care who owns what, because they are wholly satisfied with their abundant supply of material and digital goods and services. Unfortunately, every time I try to envisage this world, the picture degrades into a variation of the themes of Brave New World, or worse. Perhaps this is simply a failure of my imagination. I hope so. If it is true that we need to move away from capitalism, we have 2 major jobs on our hands. First, we need to determine what the new economy should look like. Second, we need to work out how to transition from the economy we have to the economy we need. This will not be easy. Humans dislike change, and as always, there will be winners and losers. The losers may not take their losses calmly. The scenario of the gods and the useless is not the only possible outcome of technological unemployment. The next chapter explores half a dozen of the most plausible scenarios. By assessing the likelihood and utility of each scenario and understanding how to achieve or avoid them, we may be able to achieve the most positive outcome of the economic singularity. Chapter 6. Scenarios. 6.1. No change. In a July 2015 interview with Edge, an online magazine, Pulitzer Prize-winning veteran New York Times journalist John Markoff lamented the deceleration of technological progress. In fact, he claimed that it has come to a halt. He reported that Moore's law stopped reducing the price of computer components in 2013, and pointed to the disappointing performance of the robots entered into the DARPA Robotics Challenge in June 2015, which we reviewed in Chapter 3.7. He claimed that there has been no profound technological innovation since the invention of the smartphone in 2007, and complained that basic science research has essentially died, with no modern equivalent of Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center, PARC, which was responsible for many of the fundamental features of computers which we take for granted today, like graphical user interfaces, GUIs, and indeed the PC. Markoff grew up in Silicon Valley and began writing about the Internet in the 1970s. He fears that the spirit of innovation and enterprise has gone out of the place and bemoans the absence of technologists or entrepreneurs today with the stature of past greats like Doug Engelbart, inventor of the computer mouse and much more, Bill Gates, and Steve Jobs. He argues that today's entrepreneurs are mere copycats, trying to peddle the next Uber for X. He admits that the pace of technological development might pick up again, perhaps thanks to research into metamaterials whose structure absorbs, bends, or enhances electromagnetic waves in exotic ways. He is dismissive of artificial intelligence because it has not yet produced a conscious mind, but he thinks that augmented reality might turn out to be a new platform for innovation, just as the smartphone did a decade ago. But in conclusion, he believes that 2045 is going to look more like it looks today than you think. It is tempting to think that Markoff was to some extent playing to the gallery, wallowing self-indulgently in sexagenarian nostalgia about the passing of old glories. His critique blithely ignores the arrival of social media and much else, and dismisses the basic research that goes on at Google X, DeepMind, the Human Brain Project, and elsewhere. Nevertheless, Markoff does articulate a fairly widespread point of view. Many people believe that the Industrial Revolution had a far greater impact on everyday life than anything produced by the Information Revolution. Before the arrival of railroads and then cars, most people never traveled outside their town or village, much less to a foreign country. Before the arrival of electricity and central heating, human activity was governed by the sun. Even if you were privileged enough to be able to read, it was expensive and tedious to do so by candlelight, and everything slowed down during the cold of the winter months. But it is facile to ignore the revolutions brought about by the information age. Television and the Internet have shown us how people live all around the world, and thanks to Google and Wikipedia, etc., we now have something close to omniscience. We have machines which rival us in their ability to read, recognize images, and process natural language. And the thing to remember is that the information revolution is very young. What is coming will make the Industrial Revolution, profound as it was, seem pale by comparison. As we stressed at the start of Chapter 4, the future is unknown, and all predictions are perilous. But the idea that the world will be largely unchanged 3 decades hence seems the least plausible of the scenarios set out in this chapter. 6.2. Racing with the Machines. Centaurs. We came across the idea of centaurs in Chapter 3.10. The notion comes from Garry Kasparov, the chess grandmaster who was beaten by IBM's Deep Blue computer in 1997. He noticed that, for the time being at least, a human teamed up with a machine can beat the best chess-playing computer, and he called the combination a centaur. It has since become a metaphor for the hope that humans will not be rendered economically redundant by intelligent machines, but instead will work even more closely with them, always bringing some special human magic to the combination. Icebergs. As we saw in Chapter 3.9, this hope that we can be centaurs gains some credence from the early experience with AI systems in what lawyers call discovery, or disclosure. After a few hours or days of training, deep learning systems are dramatically quicker and better than humans at plowing through huge piles of documents, looking for particular pieces of information. It was feared that these systems would remove the need for junior lawyers, but instead it turned out that the machines brought a huge new class of work into the realm of possibility. Projects that would previously have been uneconomic were now feasible, and the junior lawyers are still needed to carry out the initial training. This has been called the iceberg phenomenon. It was thought the junior lawyers were standing on thin ice, but it turned out instead that they were standing on top of a massive bulk of newly available work. Their position began to look secure again. A similar phenomenon is likely to be observed with medical diagnosis. Again, in Chapter 3.9, we saw that cheap attachments to smartphones will soon enable us all to be tested far more often and far more cheaply than at the moment. The AI resident on your smartphone, or servers it accesses in the cloud, will assess your blood pressure, blood glucose, your breath, your voice, and many more indicators, and deliver instant verdicts in most cases. Initially, at least, the upshot will be that we will have much better information about our medical condition, and we will still need doctors to carry out the more significant tests. Creativity and caring. Skeptics about technological unemployment also argue that human creativity will remain in demand, as will human empathy, which they see as a prerequisite in caring professions like nursing. Senior people in the technology companies which are developing AI often make this argument. Microsoft's principal researcher, Jonathan Gruden, for instance, says that technology will continue to disrupt jobs, but more jobs seem likely to be created. There is no shortage of things that need to be done, and that will not change. It is not surprising to hear these arguments from executives in businesses which are transforming themselves into AI companies. They would presumably feel very uncomfortable if they thought their work was hastening an economic crisis. But while technology company executives sound breezy about the prospects for continued unemployment as machine intelligences get smarter, some of the academic authors who broadly agree with them sound more tentative. In Chapter 3.1, we saw that in their book, The Second Machine Age, MIT professors Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee believe that for many years to come, humans will be better than machines at generating new ideas and complex forms of communication. They think that capitalism should be defended and retained, but they sound less confident about what will happen in the medium term. They argue for an overhaul of the U.S. education system, but they don't sound convinced that will be enough, and they speculate that a negative income tax may eventually become necessary. Tyler Cowen, whom we encountered in Chapter 3.3 as the author of Average is Over, is certainly not breezy in his assessment of the outlook, nor is he tentative. He is confident that UBI will not be needed, and he does not expect riots. But his prognosis is lugubrious. He foresees 10 to 15% of the population being extremely wealthy, and the rest getting by on incomes which are stagnant at best, but putting up with it because many of them are too old to riot, and they are pacified by the excellent cheap entertainment that technology provides. We addressed these arguments in Chapter 3.10, and we need not go over them in detail again now. In summary, the danger is that the icebergs will stop growing after a while, and the machines will need less and less training to tackle each one. The 5 million Americans who currently earn a living by driving are not all going to become computer programmers or custodians of the AIs, and it is hard to believe that we can all become professional artists, nurses, and therapists. 6.3. Capitalism plus UBI. Martin Ford, author of not one, but 2 books on technological unemployment, also believes that capitalism can survive the rise of the robots, as he calls it in the title of his second book. He thinks it will be a struggle for many people, though, so he urges policymakers to start thinking about introducing a universal basic income, UBI, of around $10,000 a head when the time is right. He believes it will be extremely challenging to introduce this policy in the U.S., given the ingrained hostility to socialism there. But as we saw in the last chapter, there are reasons to suppose that this challenge may evaporate if technological unemployment bites severely. And as we also saw in the last chapter, it may be replaced by challenges which are much harder to overcome. 6.4. Fracture. This is the gods and the useless scenario which we discussed in Chapter 5.5 about the challenge of cohesion. 6.5. Collapse. Civilization is fragile. Any school child can name some great empires which collapsed. The Romans, the Maya, the Persians. The ancient Egyptians managed to rise and fall several times during their extraordinary 3,000-year history. We also know how fragile civilization is from two famous episodes in experimental psychology. In 1961, Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram recruited students from that elite university and told them to administer mild electric shocks to incentivize a stranger who was supposed to be learning pairs of words. The shocks were fake, but the students did not know this, and an extraordinary 2/3 of the students were prepared, when urged on by the experimenter, to deliver what appeared to be very painful and damaging doses of electricity. The experiment has been replicated numerous times around the world with similar results. 10 years later, Stanford psychology professor Philip Zimbardo, a school friend of Milgram's, ran a different experiment in which students were recruited and arbitrarily assigned the roles of prisoners and guards in a make-believe prison. He was shocked to see how enthusiastically sadistic the students who were chosen to be guards became, and he was obliged to terminate the exercise early. This experiment has also been replicated numerous times. Our 21st century global civilization seems pretty robust. We have just gone through what is frequently described as the worst recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s, and for the great majority of people, the experience was nothing like as awful as those terrible years which did so much to set up the disastrous carnage of World War II. But history and experimental psychology demonstrate that we cannot afford to be complacent. If the argument of this book is correct, we are about to embark on a journey towards a new type of economy which we have not yet designed. Unless we are careful, there will be plenty of opportunities for missteps, misunderstandings, and downright mischief by the populists and demagogues. If technological unemployment arrives in a rush, and we are not prepared, a lot of people will lose their incomes quickly, and governments may not move fast enough to avert drastic collapse in asset prices as people sell their belongings to make ends meet. If the introduction of UBI is slow or botched in some countries, the resulting economic crises could lead to their governments being overthrown by irresponsible or foolish leaders. We must hope this does not happen in any countries with significant stocks of nuclear weapons. 6.6. Protopia. Utopia, dystopia, protopia. Kevin Kelly is a writer and the founding editor of Wired magazine. He has been called the most interesting man in the world. I'm not sure whether he enjoys the burden of that appellation, but he does produce a lot of interesting ideas. One of his good ones is Protopia. Too much of today's thinking about the future is dystopian, and that is partly because too many people fail to realize just how much progress Homo sapiens has made in the last few centuries and decades. It is natural and indeed helpful for our species to be discontented. If we weren't discontented, we probably wouldn't struggle to make the world a better place, but it can lead to misunderstandings. Many people think that all politicians are corrupt, and that all corporations are run by Bond villains who are greedy and bent on world domination. Most of us could think of some group, clique, or tribe that we are suspicious, fearful, or disdainful of. But the truth is that in most of the world, today is the best time there has ever been to be alive. Most people in developed countries today live better than kings and queens did a couple of centuries ago. We live longer, eat better, have better health care, and inconceivably better access to information and entertainment than previous generations. Of course, everything could go horribly wrong tomorrow. There might even be an iron law of nature that when civilizations reach a certain stage, they either blow themselves up or create machines to do it for them. But from where we stand today, there's no reason to believe that. It seems more likely that the future is open and potentially very good indeed. Utopian visions of the future are less common, but also problematic. A future in which life has, to all intents and purposes, become perfect sounds sterile and boring. It is also highly improbable. The more we learn about the universe, the more we discover that we don't know. So it seems unlikely the universe will one day stop presenting us with puzzles and challenges. Perhaps this is why the two best-known literary descriptions of utopias, Thomas More's Utopia and Voltaire's Candide, are essentially critiques of the societies they lived in rather than recipes for an ideal future one. So it is refreshing to read Kelly saying this: "I am a protopian, not a utopian. I believe in progress in an incremental way where every year it's better than the year before, but not by very much, just a micro amount. I don't believe in utopia where there's any kind of a world without problems brought on by technology. Every new technology creates almost as many problems that it solves. But crucially, it gives us a choice that we did not have before. And that tips it very, very slightly in the category of the sum of good." Collective ownership. What might a society look like which has passed successfully through the event horizon of the economic singularity? Machines are producing virtually all the goods and services that we would otherwise pay people to produce, and the society has avoided the twin traps of fracture and collapse. Everyone shares in the bounty that the machines are producing, and almost everyone has found meaning and joy in their lives without jobs. There is no enforcement of a rigid equality of personal outcomes across the lives of everyone in this society, but there is also no increasingly entrenched divergence between those with access to all the latest technologies and those without. In Chapter 5.5, we confronted the possibility that this society has felt obliged to abandon our powerful attachment to the concept of private property, and has moved to some form of collective ownership of the means of production, exchange, and distribution. In other words, socialism. Those of us who are convinced that the free market economy, suitably regulated, is an ingenious system that has demonstrably created the best standards of living that humans have ever enjoyed, will find this hard to swallow. Certainly the idea takes some getting used to. Advocates of capitalism who have thought this far ahead have suggested that their favorite economic model is the best system for an economy of scarcity, but that perhaps it won't be appropriate for an economy of abundance. The problem highlighted by the scenario of the gods and the useless reveals a different problem. Scarcity hasn't disappeared. It has changed and become more dangerous. The new scarcity is the privileged access to an accelerating flow of powerful new enhancement technologies. The danger is that the elite which enjoys the privileged access will rapidly become a separate species, a dominant species. Both history and common sense suggest that is unlikely to work out well for everyone else. The new scarce resource, the privileged access to the cascade of new technologies, is even more valuable and powerful than any scarce resource that we value today. When normal people read about the lives of billionaires and movie stars, we often think they live in a different world, but the distance which separates them from us is tiny compared to the gulf which could open up between the AI-owning elite and the unemployed majority in a world which passed through the economic singularity while retaining private property. In Chapter 4, I described a timeline for a successful navigation of the economic singularity. It ended up with the AI-owning elites transferring their assets into collective ownership and being hailed as heroes and heroines for doing so. How might this work in practice? Decentralization. Part of the genius of the market economy, the reason why it is so effective, is that decisions are taken by the people best qualified to take them. The market enables, indeed obliges, each of us to provide truthful signals about what we do and don't want, what we do and don't value. We buy this car and not that car because we prefer it, given our budgetary constraints, and there is no doubt that we are providing a correct signal because we are spending our own money. The decisions taken by the market overall about how many of each car to make are the aggregate of all these signals. By contrast, when decisions are made in a centralized planned economy, somebody is guessing about what is wanted and needed at every level below them. However good their data collection system, and however well-intentioned they are, they will always be out of date, and they will often be just plain wrong. There is also a very good chance that corruption will set in, because it is so easy for that to happen. With apologies to Lord Acton, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and corruption is central to centralized planning. Common ownership can work well in small communities, such as families, tribes, and small villages. But as soon as society attains any level of size and sophistication, the bonds of kinship weaken and individuals start to claim ownership over land and property. The society becomes regulated by power structures which begin as a means of self-defense and evolve into expression of ambition. If, And it is a big if. Surviving the economic singularity and avoiding fracture means ending the system of private ownership. How can this be done without falling into the unwelcome embrace of an overmighty state and centralized planning? The answer just might be the blockchain. Blockchain. People have gone mad trying to understand how the blockchain works, never mind trying to explain it. Its most famous application is Bitcoin, the world's first completely decentralized digital currency. In just a few years, the Bitcoin economy has grown larger than the economies of some countries. The value of a Bitcoin has fluctuated wildly, hitting a peak of $1,216 in November 2013. The insights which made Bitcoin possible were published in 2008 under the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto, and the blockchain is at the heart of it. The blockchain is a public ledger which records transactions. The clever bit is that the ledger is completely trustworthy despite having no central authority, like a bank, to validate it. It is trustworthy in that you can have full confidence that if someone gives you a Bitcoin, then you do own that Bitcoin. The person who gave it to you will not be nipping off to spend the same piece of currency elsewhere, even though it's entirely digital. This confidence arises because transactions are recorded in blocks which are added to the chain by people, or rather computer algorithms, called miners. These miners are working continuously on mathematical problems whose solutions are hard to find but easy to verify. A problem is solved, mined, roughly every 10 minutes, and each solution creates a block. The new block is added to the chain and incorporates the transactions made since the last block was added to the chain. Your transaction is published on the blockchain's network as soon as it is agreed, but it is only confirmed, and hence reliable, when a miner has incorporated it into a block. Satoshi Nakamoto's innovation solved a previously intractable challenge in computer science known as the Byzantine general's problem. Imagine a medieval city surrounded by a dozen armies, each led by a powerful general. If the armies mount a coordinated attack, their victory is assured, but they can only communicate by messengers on horseback who visit the generals one by one, and some of the generals are untrustworthy. The blockchain provides a way for each general to know that a message calling for an attack at a particular time is genuine, and has not been fabricated by a dishonest general before it reached him. Digital currency is only one of the possible applications of blockchain technology. It can register and validate all sorts of transactions and relationships. For instance, it could be used to manage the sale, lease, or hire of a car. When you take possession of a car, it could be tagged with a cryptographic signature, which would mean that you are the only person who could open and start the car. The revolutionary benefit of the blockchain is that all kinds of agreements can be validated without setting up a centralized institution to do so. By removing the need for a central intermediary, the blockchain can reduce transaction costs, and it can enhance privacy. No government agents need to have access to your data without your permission. Most importantly, for our present purposes, the blockchain may make possible the decentralized ownership and management of collective assets. Collective ownership. Imagine a future in which it is apparent to many people that we are heading towards the scenario of the gods and the useless. The elite few who own the machines are as uncomfortable as the rest of us about this, or at least a sizable number of them are. They do not want to hand their assets over to a government organization, as they believe this would simply swap one potentially dangerous elite for another one. But they realize that if the scenarios of the gods and the useless becomes reality, they will end up as pariahs, feared and perhaps hated by the rest of their species. This outcome might well be grim for the useless, but it would be unpleasant for the gods as well. I don't believe the common meme that rich people are all bad, greedy, and selfish. I have known quite a few and worked for some of them. They seem to me to be the same mix of good and bad, greedy and generous as the rest of us. They tend to be smart and hard-working, but otherwise they are pretty normal, which is to say that curious human blend of similar and different, happy and sad, predictable and unpredictable. When machines do all the paid jobs, they will be enormously efficient. Many goods and services will be effectively free. Others will be cheap and getting cheaper. But new products and services will be being invented all the time, and those which require considerable resources will be more expensive. Everyone will have a certain amount of UBI, and the way they spend it will give the machines a set of pricing signals to enable them to allocate resources sensibly. Life should be good and getting better for most people. Protopia could be within reach. It strikes me as entirely plausible that in this scenario the smallish minority which owns most of the assets when the game of musical chairs stopped, including notably the AI, would prefer to throw in their lot with the rest of us rather than hide behind heavily fortified gates, outcasts from the rest of their species. It would be a non-trivial project to work out in detail how the assets could be transferred into universal common ownership, validated by the blockchain, and managed in a decentralized fashion. And it is certainly not a foregone conclusion that the rich minority would endorse it. But I suspect it will turn out to be our best way forward. Chapter 7. Summary and Recommendations. 7.1. The Argument. Automation and Unemployment. This book has argued that improvements in machine intelligence over the next few decades are going to make it impossible for most humans to earn a living. It concluded that we would be wise to devote some resource to working out how to deal with this development. Indeed, that we would be foolish not to. In Chapter 2, we look back at the Industrial Revolution and saw how concerns that automation would lead to permanent mass unemployment turned out to be unfounded. The Ingalls pause was lengthy, but not permanent. Instead, automation raised productivity and output across the economy. The unfounded concerns became known as the Luddite fallacy. In Chapter 3.1 and 3.2, we reviewed claims that this time is different. In the information revolution, mankind's third great wave of transformation, machines are increasingly able to outperform humans in cognitive tasks. This might put humans in the predicament that horses were placed in by the Industrial Revolution. In 1900, 40% of American workers were employed in agriculture, and that has now fallen below 3%. The farm workers found better jobs elsewhere in the economy, sometimes in occupations which their parents could not have imagined. But horses didn't. 1900 was peak horse in America, with about 25 million of them working on farms. Now there are fewer than 3 million. The difference between the horses and the humans is that when machines took over the muscle jobs, humans had something else to offer: our cognitive, emotional, and social abilities. Horses had nothing else to offer, and their population collapsed. In Chapter 3.3, we heard the response that this is merely a revival of the Luddite fallacy, and the rest of Chapter 3 explored this debate in detail. We considered whether technological automation is biting yet, and saw that the U.S. economy has added a significant number of jobs since the banking crisis, although incomes have stagnated. It is hard to disentangle the effects of technology on the job market from the effects of globalization and other effects, but it does not seem likely that machine intelligence is creating widespread unemployment yet. In Chapter 3.4, we reviewed the state-of-the-art in artificial intelligence, and in Chapter 3.5, the exponential rate at which it is improving. We saw that machines are still a long way from becoming artificial general intelligences, AGIs, computers with all the cognitive abilities of an adult human, including our flexibility. Even today's smartest machines are still artificial narrow intelligences. They may be superhuman at playing video games or Go, but they cannot tie your shoelaces or sell you a house, and they are not even aware that they are playing a game. The fact is that machines don't need to become AGIs to displace most of us from our jobs. They simply have to become better than us at what we do for a living. Because they are overtaking us at many forms of pattern recognition, including image recognition, speech recognition, and natural language processing, they are in the process of overtaking us. And of course, once a machine can do your job, it will quickly be able to do it faster, better, and cheaper than you can. Machines don't eat, sleep, get drunk, tired, or cranky. And unlike human brains, their abilities continue to improve at an exponential rate. In Chapter 3.6, we asked what capabilities people bring to the workplace. And in Chapter 3.7, we reviewed the related technologies which are being introduced alongside AI, including personal digital assistants, robotics, virtual reality, augmented reality, and the Internet of Things. We discussed the concerns which these technologies raise about privacy, security, isolation, and inequality. In Chapters 3.8 and 3.9, We discussed how widespread unemployment might arise in practice, first among drivers, as self-driving vehicles take over their function, and then in a range of other industries, including occupations like retail and sales, and the professions. In Chapter 3.10, we assessed the claim that fears about unemployment are overdone because we will invent new kinds of jobs as machines take over the old ones. We reviewed the idea that we can race with the machines instead of against them, becoming centaurs and occupying ourselves with the icebergs of new work which machines have made possible. But at the end of it all, we concluded that these are only likely to be temporary respites. Whatever jobs we invent, the machines will take over most of them as well. In the medium term, a large minority of people, perhaps the majority, will not be able to earn a living through work. The upside. In Chapter 3.11, we saw how this does not have to be bad news. In fact, it can be extremely good news. Some people are lucky enough to love their jobs and find fulfillment in them. For many more people, work is simply a way to generate an income. It may provide a purpose, but it does not provide meaning. A world in which machines do all the boring work could be wonderful. They could be so efficient that goods and services could be plentiful, and in many cases free. Humans could get on with the important business of playing, relaxing, socializing, learning, and exploring. Surely this is what we should be aiming for. Chapter 4 provided a timeline, emphatically not a forecast, of a scenario in which humanity makes a successful transition towards this enormously positive outcome. Challenges and scenarios. Of course, there are challenges, and we turned to these in Chapter 5, looking in turn at concerns about economic contraction, distribution, meaning, allocation, and cohesion. In Chapter 5.2, we explored the idea of Universal Basic Income, UBI, a payment made to all citizens, which allows them to live fulfilling lives when they are no longer able to find paid jobs. We heard that thoughtful people in America are concerned that the traditional antipathy to socialism will prevent the introduction of UBI. But we concluded that once it becomes obvious that plenty of sensible, diligent, and hard-working people can no longer afford to keep themselves and their families, any such opposition will quickly fade. Nevertheless, the fact that people are concerned does underscore the need for a public debate about what is coming towards us. In Chapter 5.3, we discussed the fear that unemployed humans will find their new lives hollow, lacking in meaning, and perhaps even boring. We concluded that this too is unfounded. For centuries, aristocrats in most countries didn't work for a living, and in many societies they viewed work as a demeaning activity to be avoided by people of quality. Some of them got into trouble with drink, drugs, and gambling, but only a small minority. Most of them seem to have led contented lives, however questionable we might find the economic systems they operated in. Likewise, retirement is rarely considered a disaster in developed countries. Even though most of us only get to enjoy it when we are past our prime, most retirees find enough projects and pastimes to keep themselves busy and at peace. Numerous surveys have found that happiness is U-shaped. We are at our most content during childhood and retirement, and it is probably no coincidence that these are the periods in our lives when we don't work for a living. If we retired when still in our primes, we would be even better equipped to enjoy our lives of leisure. In Chapter 5.4, we considered whether virtual reality might help resolve the problem of how to allocate rare goods and services in a world where incomes are hard to vary. In Chapter 5.5, we tackled what may turn out to be the biggest challenge raised by the economic singularity: cohesion. We asked whether capitalism, and in particular the institution of private property, will be as suitable for the post-work world as it has been during the Industrial Revolution. This is an uncomfortable discussion for people like me who believe that a sensibly regulated market economy has been enormously beneficial for humanity. Along with the Enlightenment and the consequent scientific revolution, capitalism has made our time the best era to be born human, bar none. But a world where almost no one works, and an elite owns the intelligent machines, is going to be a world of fantastic and entrenched inequality. Inequality is often overestimated as a contemporary social evil, but this post-economic singularity world will also be one where advancing technology makes available radical enhancements to our physical and cognitive performance. These enhancements will come along faster and faster, and groups with privileged access to them may start to diverge from everyone else and become a separate species. The author Yuval Harari has referred to this scenario in the chilling phrase, the gods and the useless. The Brave New World, depicted by Aldous Huxley in 1931, might be one of the least bad outcomes of this scenario. If the post-economic singularity world needs a different type of economy, then we need to start thinking now about what that might be, and also how to get there. The damage that could be caused by an uneven or violent transition to the new world could be immense. In Chapter 6, we pulled these threads together with a review of half a dozen potential scenarios. Chapter 6.1 presented and dismissed the idea that technological progress had slowed almost to a halt, and there was nothing to worry about. Chapter 6.2 rehearsed the hope that we can race with the machines by becoming centaurs and enjoying the icebergs of new work. Chapter 6.3 offered the idea that unemployment will grow, but can be accommodated by UBI. Chapter 6.4 reprised the scenario of the gods and the useless, and Chapter 6.5 reminded us that civilization is fragile, and that a poorly planned transition towards a new economy could be hazardous. Chapter 6.6 adopted Kevin Kelly's term protopia for a successful transition, and suggested that the blockchain might turn out to be the mechanism to administer society's collectively owned assets, notably its artificial intelligence. 7.2. The Two Singularities. In my previous book, Surviving AI, I wrote at length about the challenge and the opportunity presented by the technological singularity, the moment when and if we create an artificial general intelligence which continues to improve its cognitive performance and becomes a superintelligence. Ensuring that we survive that event, I believe, the single most important task facing the next generation or two of humans, along with making sure we don't blow ourselves up with nuclear weapons or unleash a pathogen which kills everyone. If we secure the good outcome to the technological singularity, the future of humanity is glorious almost beyond imagination. As DeepMind co-founder Demis Hassabis likes to say, humanity's plan for the future should consist of two steps. First, solve artificial general intelligence, and second, use that to solve everything else. Everything else includes poverty, illness, war, and even death itself. The stakes in the economic singularity are not so high, which is why I tackled it second. If we find ourselves in the gods and the useless scenario, or if our societies collapse as we fail to transition from modern capitalism to something more suitable for the new world, it is unlikely that every human will die. Not impossible, though, as someone might initiate a catastrophic nuclear war. Civilization would presumably regress, perhaps drastically, but our species would survive to try again. Trying again is something we are good at. On the other hand, if it is coming at all, the economic singularity is coming sooner than the technological singularity. No one knows how long it will take to build an artificial general intelligence, but it looks tremendously hard. It is probably only a matter of time, but that time may well be quite a few decades. The economic singularity is likely to be with us in 2 or 3 decades. Perhaps not in the sense that a majority of people will be unemployable by then, but in the sense that it will be obvious and undeniable that it is going to happen. Asset prices may collapse at that point. Relatively speaking, then, the technological singularity is more important but less urgent, while the economic singularity is less important but more urgent. 7.3. What is to be done? Relinquishment won't work. Impressed by the dangers attending the two singularities, you might think it would be a good idea to call a halt to further development of artificial intelligence research, either permanently or simply for long enough to allow us to work out how to ensure that both events are beneficial. Unfortunately, this is impossible. First, we would not know what research to pause. Improvements in the performance of AI comes from many directions: chip design and manufacture, algorithm development, the accumulation and statistical analysis of data, to name but three. Unless we could arrest pretty much all scientific and technological research, we could not be sure that someone, somewhere, was not working on something which will advance AI. Second, the incentive to develop and deploy a better AI than the competition is literally irresistible. For companies like Google and Facebook, who are leading the way in AI research, it is a matter of critical commercial performance in the short term, and of economic survival in the medium and long term. For military commanders, it is quite literally a matter of life and death. Even if by some miracle all the world's leading politicians could be gathered together and persuaded to sign a joint declaration that all AI research will stop, they would not abide by it. We can all agree that North Korea would cheat, but who would be so naive as to think that their own government would not do the same? If it is possible to create an artificial general intelligence, it will be created, and it will be created as soon as it becomes possible. The same applies to the technologies required to render most humans unemployable. Monitoring. There are at least 4 permanently established organizations studying the risk to humanity posed by the potential arrival of superintelligence. There is only one that I know of which is studying the future of automation and technological unemployment. There should be more. In Chapter 4, we explored how hard it is to make accurate forecasts, but failing to keep a lookout for approaching dangers and opportunities is foolish. The view that most people will be rendered unemployable by machine intelligence within the next few decades is probably a minority opinion at the moment, but a great many people are uncertain about what will happen, and the case argued in this book and elsewhere is surely at least plausible enough to be worth watching out for. We should be employing economists and others to monitor the available data for signs of technological unemployment and devising new ways to detect it. The economist Robin Hanson thinks that machines will eventually render most humans unemployed, but that it will not happen for many decades, probably centuries. Despite this skepticism, he proposes an interesting way to watch out for the eventuality: prediction markets. People make their best estimates when they have some skin in the forecasting game. Offering people the opportunity to bet real money on when they see their own jobs or other people's jobs being automated may be an effective way to improve our forecasting. Planning. We don't have sufficient information to draw up detailed plans for the way we would like our economies and societies to evolve. But we can, and probably should, be doing detailed scenario planning. Scenario planning has been practiced by military leaders since time immemorial. It was given the name by Herman Kahn, who wrote narratives about possible futures for the U.S. military while working for the Rand Corporation in the 1950s. His suggestion that a nuclear war might be both winnable and survivable made him one of the inspirations for Dr. Strangelove in the classic 1964 movie. Scenario planning was adopted by Shell Oil after it, along with the rest of the industry, was disastrously wrong-footed by the rise of the oil cartel OPEC in the 1970s. Scenario planning is more art than science, but it can be a valuable discipline. When we commit our thoughts about a possible future to paper, we are forced to consider them rigorously. Institutes consisting of smart people doing this work could make a valuable contribution. An informal version of this is the daily business of futurists and futurologists, people who are often viewed with skepticism by the wider public. Perhaps that will change. In fact, perhaps futurology will come to be seen as a mission-critical profession. Science fiction writers also have an important role in providing vivid metaphors and warnings. The role of the tech giants. Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, IBM, and Apple are shaping the new world we are moving into, along with their Chinese counterparts Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. Their motivation is partly commercial. They understood sooner than anyone else that artificial intelligence and related technologies will increasingly provide most of the world's economic value. They are moving aggressively to dominate the AI space and competing fiercely with each other for talent and market positions. Although I have no privileged access, it seems to me that many of the leading figures in this industry are also motivated by something else, a belief that the future will be better than today, and an impatience to make it arrive faster. It is ironic, then, that these companies are often reluctant to talk about their vision. In particular, they shy away from discussing AI. It is understandable. Every time they talk to a journalist about AI, the resulting article is accompanied by a picture of the Terminator. It must be enormously frustrating to be working hard to conjure a happier, richer, safer world when all you get in response is talk about existential risks. It may be understandable, but it is also dangerous. The idea that artificial intelligence is improving quickly is now firmly in the public mind. When self-driving cars become common, smartphones are capable of sensible conversations, and domestic robots can carry out many of our domestic chores, people will increasingly ask where it is all heading. In the absence of optimistic answers, they will gravitate towards the bad ones, and Hollywood has given us plenty of those. We need potent new memes illustrating the current benefits and the future promise of AI. The tech giants are creating this new world, even if only for their own self-preservation. It would be a good idea for them to explain how it is capable of being a glorious new world. What should I study? The question that young people and their parents naturally ask about the economic singularity is, how can I best prepare for the economy that we are moving towards? It's an important question for me, too. At the time of writing, my son is 15. The obvious answer is to study computing. Computers are at the heart of the changes sweeping the world in the information revolution, so it has to be valuable to understand how they work and what they can and cannot do. If possible, study machine learning, and in particular, deep learning. It seems a safe bet that these powerful techniques will remain important for years to come. Carrying out maintenance, supervision, or development of hardware or software may keep you in a job for longer than most. In the long run, however, if the argument of this book is correct, we are probably all unemployed. It may well be an advantage for a while to be rich, but if we manage the transition successfully, that may become less important and less worthwhile. And if we don't, well, let's just say we have to. Beyond the economic singularity, you're going to want to have as rich an interior life as possible. So give yourself as broad an education as you can. Studying your own and other people's languages will give you insights into how our minds work. Studying sciences will give you insights into how the world works. And studying the humanities will give you insights into how societies work. All of these should make what could be a very long life an interesting one. The most important generations. Every generation thinks the challenges it faces are more important than what has gone before. They can't all be correct. American journalist Tom Brokaw bestowed the name "the greatest generation" on the people who grew up in the Great Depression and went on to fight in the Second World War. As a baby boomer myself, I certainly take my hat off to that generation. Speaking at the United Nations in 1963, John F. Kennedy said something which would not sound out of place today. Never before has a man had such capacity to control his own environment, to end thirst and hunger, to conquer poverty and disease, to banish illiteracy and massive human misery. We have the power to make this the best generation of mankind in the history of the world, or make it the last. Today's rising generation is the millennials, born between the early 1980s and the early 2000s. They are also known as Generation Y, and the one after them, born from the early 2000s to the early 2020s, is provisionally called Generation Z. Let's hope that is not prophetic. The millennials and Generation Z have been born at the best time ever to be a human in terms of life expectancy, health, wealth, access to education, information, and entertainment. They have also been born at the most interesting time, and the most important. Whether they like it or not, they have the task of navigating us through the economic singularity of mass unemployment, and then the technological singularity of superintelligence. If they succeed, humanity's future is almost incredibly good. If not, it could be bleak. It will fall largely to them to plot the course, adjust it where necessary, avoid the rocks and the cries of the sirens, and bring the ship safely home. Thank you for listening to The Economic Singularity, Artificial Intelligence and the Death of Capitalism. Written by Callum Chase. Narrated by Joe Hempel. Copyright 2016 by Callum Chase. Production copyright 2016 by Callum Chase.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.